He was kneeling in front of my Bernardin cabinet with a screwdriver, prying open the false back where I keep my mother's wedding ring. I'd come home 2 hours early from my book club because the snow was coming down hard off Lake Ontario, and Marjorie had to drive her grandkids back to Oakville before the QEW got bad. My boots were still on. I hadn't even taken my coat off. And there he was, my daughter's husband, the man who'd sat at my kitchen table just that morning eating the cinnamon rolls I'd baked, kneeling on my hardwood with my grandmother's silver letter opener wedged into the cabinet like a pry bar. I should back up. My name doesn't matter much for the story, but I'll tell you, I'm 67 years old, widowed 11 years this past November, and I live in a brick bungalow in the east end of Hamilton that my husband Don and I bought in 1981 for $42,000. The mortgage was paid off in 2003. Don died of a heart attack in his garden the summer he was supposed to retire, and I've been alone in this house ever since, except for the 4 months my daughter and her husband lived with me last winter, which is what this whole story is about. My daughter, I'll call her my girl because that's what I called her since the day she was born, was 34 when she came back home. She'd been living in Calgary with her husband for almost 6 years. He worked in the oil patch, something to do with land surveying, and she was a dental hygienist at a clinic in Kensington. Good money, both of them. They had a townhouse in Bridlewood and 2 cats in a leased Forester. By every measure I could see from 2,500 kilometers away, they were doing fine. Then in October 2023, she called me on a Tuesday morning, which was strange because she usually called Sundays after church, and her voice was thin in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. The company he worked for had let him go. Restructuring, she said. They'd been living above their means, she said. The credit card debt was worse than she'd realized. They were going to lose the townhouse. Could they come stay with me just for a few months until he found something and they got back on their feet? I said yes before she finished asking. Of course I said yes. She's my only child. Dawn and I tried for years before she came along, and I lost 2 before her, and when she was finally here and healthy and screaming her lungs out in the maternity ward at McMaster, Dawn wept into my shoulder and said this is the only thing that matters now. Of course I said yes. They drove out in November. 3 days on the Trans-Canada with the cats yowling in the back of a U-Haul. They got in late on a Thursday night, and when my daughter stepped out of the truck onto my driveway in the porch light, I saw her face, and I knew something more was wrong than just money. She'd lost weight. Her cheeks had a hollow to them. She wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I hugged her. He got out of the driver's side, stretching his back, all 6'2" of him, and he came up to me with his arms wide and said, "Thanks for taking us in, eh? You're a lifesaver." And he hugged me, and I patted his back, and I thought, my goodness, when did I start being afraid of this man? Because that was the truth. I'd been a little afraid of him for years. Nothing I could point to, just a feeling. The way he'd interrupt her at family dinners. The way he'd laugh at her stories in a way that wasn't really laughing. The way she got quieter and quieter every Christmas when they came home, and then they stopped coming home for Christmas at all. 3 years running, because of his job, he said. I'd never told anyone, not even Dawn, when Dawn was alive. What was there to tell? My son-in-law was perfectly polite. He sent me flowers on my birthday. He called me Mum. The first month wasn't bad. They took my spare room downstairs, the one Dawn used to use as a den. I gave them their privacy, he went on, indeed, every morning at the kitchen table and circled jobs in the Hamilton Spectator. She got temporary work at a dental office in Stony Creek. We had supper together most nights. I cooked. They ate. He thanked me. I started to think maybe I'd been wrong about him all those years. Maybe I'd been a snobbish mother who never thought anyone was good enough for her girl. Then in early December, things started. Small things. My daughter would come home from work, and he'd ask her in front of me why she'd taken the long way through Stony Creek. He'd ask in this calm voice, like he was just curious, but I watched her face do this little freeze, and she'd explain, and he'd nod and say nothing, and the air in the kitchen would feel like the inside of a cold fridge for the next hour. One Saturday I was making butter tarts and she was helping me roll the pastry, and she laughed at something I said, a real laugh from her belly that I hadn't heard since she was a kid, and he came up the stairs from the basement and stood in the doorway and just looked at her. Didn't say anything, just looked. And she stopped laughing and went back to rolling pastry and her hands were shaking. I wasn't imagining it. I started watching, the way you watch a bird that you think might be hurt. I watched at supper. I watched in the morning when he was on his laptop and she was getting ready for work. I watched him watching her, and I watched her shrink. There was a Tuesday in mid-December. I came home from getting groceries at the Fortinos on Centennial, and I heard him in the basement on the phone. He was talking loud the way men do when they think they're alone in a house. He said, "She's losing it, man. She's not the same person. The mother's a piece of work. Treats her like she's still 12. And then he laughed and he said, "Yeah, well, the house is paid off, eh? That's the thing. Old lady doesn't even have a mortgage. Dawn left her sitting pretty." I stood at the top of the basement stairs with 2 bags of groceries, and I felt my hands go cold around the plastic handles. I didn't say anything. I went into the kitchen. I put the milk in the fridge and the canned tomatoes in the pantry and the bread on the counter. My daughter came home at 6, and I watched her come through the door and unwind her scarf and ask if there was anything she could help with, and I watched him come up out of the basement and kiss her cheek and ask how her day was. And I cooked shepherd's pie and we ate it together like a family. That night I lay in bed and thought, I am 67 years old. I have been a daycare administrator for 31 years. I am not a fool. I know what I heard. And I know what I'm going to do. The next morning, after he left for what he said was a job interview in Burlington, I called my friend Patricia. Patricia and I have known each other since 1979. She used to be a paralegal at a firm on James Street North, and her son-in-law is a family lawyer. I told her everything. She listened. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Get out a notepad. Write down everything you've noticed since they got there. Dates, times, exact words if you can remember them. And then I want you to call my Stephen. He'll talk to you for free." I called Stephen that afternoon. He told me a few things I didn't know. In Ontario, you can record any conversation you're a part of without telling the other person. You can't record conversations you're not part of, but anything in the common areas of my own home, where I could be, was fair game if I was the one who could come and go from those rooms. He said it wasn't necessarily evidence in court, but it was useful for showing patterns. He said the bigger issue was the house. He said, "Are you on title alone?" I said yes. He said, "Don't put anyone else on title, don't sign anything, don't even sign a Christmas card he hands you without reading it twice." I bought 2 small recording devices off Amazon. They came in a plain brown box. They looked like USB chargers, the kind you plug into the wall. One of them had a little hole the size of a pinhead that was the microphone. I plugged one into the outlet behind the kettle in the kitchen. I plugged the other one into the outlet in the front hallway, near the coat closet, where they hung their jackets and where they often stood and talked when they came in. I checked them every other day. I downloaded the audio onto a USB stick and labeled them by date with a Sharpie and put them in a coffee tin in my bedroom closet. I started a notebook, a black hardcover Hilroy I'd bought at the Shoppers. I wrote down dates. I wrote down quotes. I wrote down what my girl was wearing and how she looked. I wrote down the bruise I saw on her wrist on December 21st, the one she said was from slipping on ice in the parking lot at work. I wrote down the way her hand shook when she poured tea on Christmas morning. I didn't tell my girl. That was the hardest part. I didn't tell her because I didn't trust that she would keep it from him. Not because she'd betray me on purpose, but because he had a way of getting things out of her. I'd watched it for 10 years, and I'd just never had a name for it before. In January, I called a locksmith, told my son-in-law a story about a leaky pipe under the bathroom sink that needed fixing, and while the locksmith was here, he also installed a new deadbolt on my bedroom door and a separate lock on the small office I'd made out of Dawn's old sewing room, where I keep the safe. The safe is a Sentry, fireproof, bolted to the floor. Inside it, I keep the title to the house, my will, the cash from selling Dawn's truck, my mother's wedding ring, the bond certificates Dawn's father left him, and about $11,000 in 20s that I'd been pulling out of my checking account 50 at a time over the years for what Dawn used to call the running away money. He was joking. I never thought I'd actually have to think about running. When my son-in-law came home that evening, he tried the office door. I was in the kitchen pretending to read the spec. I heard the handle rattle. He came into the kitchen and said, "Hey, Mom, why's the office locked?" And I looked up over my reading glasses and said, "Oh, I lost the key years ago and Dawn was going to fix it. I keep meaning to call someone." He looked at me for a long second. He has light brown eyes, my son-in-law. They're very still when he's thinking. He said, "I could help you with that. I'm pretty handy. I said, "Oh, that's all right, dear. It's just a junk room anyway." He nodded slowly. "Okay, Mum." The recording device caught all of it. In the next 2 weeks, I caught a lot more. He told my daughter, when they thought I was upstairs, that her mother was getting confused, that her mother had asked him the same question twice last Tuesday, that maybe they should be thinking about powers of attorney, that maybe they should be thinking about the long term, that the house was a lot to manage for someone my age. She said in this small voice that I seemed fine to her. He said, "You're too close to it, sweetheart. You don't see it." I caught him on the phone with someone, I think it was his brother, talking about how if they could get her to sign over power of attorney, we could refinance the place. The equity in that house alone has to be $650, $700. I caught him telling her she shouldn't be calling her mother about everything, that she was a grown woman, that her mother was making her dependent. I caught him telling her after she dropped a glass washing dishes and started crying for no reason I could understand, that she was unstable lately, that maybe she should see somebody, that he was worried about her. I made copies of everything. Patricia's son-in-law Stephen, the lawyer, kept one set in his office safe. I kept another set with my friend Marjorie in a sealed envelope in case anything happened to me. I sound paranoid writing this. I know I do. But you weren't there. You didn't hear what I heard. In late January, my daughter came up to my room one night around 11. He was asleep downstairs. She knocked very softly and I let her in, and she sat on the end of my bed in her flannel pajamas, the same kind I'd bought her when she was 12, and she said, "Mum, I think there's something wrong with me." I said, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She said, "I don't know. I can't think straight anymore. I forget things. I cry all the time." He says it's hormonal, but I don't think it is. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I sat there in my bed and I looked at my daughter who used to climb the chestnut tree in the backyard and read Anne of Green Gables on the highest branch, and I said, "You are not losing your mind." She started to cry. Quiet crying, the kind where you press your hands against your mouth so no one downstairs hears. I said, "Sweetheart, can I tell you something? But you have to promise me you won't say anything to him." She nodded. I told her I loved her. I told her I loved her. I told her I'd always loved her. I told her I wasn't going to tell her what to think, but I wanted her to know that I had ears in this house and I had heard things. I didn't play her any of the recordings. I wasn't ready and she wasn't ready. I just told her I'd noticed things. I asked her if she'd been happy in Calgary. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I don't remember the last time I was happy." I held her until she fell asleep on top of my comforter. I covered her with the Afghan my mother knit before I was born. In the morning, she went back downstairs before he woke up, and she didn't mention any of it, and neither did I. But something had shifted between us, a small thing, and I don't think he saw it. 2 days later was the day with the screwdriver in the cabinet. He'd told me at breakfast he had a job interview in Mississauga and would be gone all day. He'd told my daughter the same thing. She'd gone to work at 7:30. I left at 9 for book club at the church. Marjorie's grandkids in the snowstorm, and I came home at 1:15 instead of 3:30. I came in through the side door, the one off the carport, and I came up the 3 steps to the kitchen, and the kitchen was empty, but the light was on in my office, and I could hear the careful scrape of metal on wood. I stood very still in my own kitchen, with snow melting off my boots onto the lino. Then I did 3 things in about a minute and a half. I took out my phone, I texted Stephen, the lawyer, 1 word, which was the word we'd agreed on, which was now. I called the non-emergency police line, which I had taped to the side of the fridge. I told the dispatcher there was an intruder in my house, that he was a family member who did not have permission to be in the room he was in, that I was downstairs and afraid, and that I needed officers to come quietly. No sirens because I didn't want to startle him into hurting me. I gave my address. I hung up. Then I walked very softly back out the side door, and I stood in my carport in the snow, and I waited. The cruiser came in 7 minutes. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both about my daughter's age. I told them everything in a whisper, standing by their cruiser. I gave the woman officer the USB stick I'd been carrying in my purse for 3 weeks. I told her my lawyer was on his way. I said, "He thinks I'm not home. He thinks I won't be home for another 2 hours. The male officer asked if there was any chance my son-in-law was armed. I said not that I knew of, that we don't keep guns in the house, that Don never wanted them. He nodded. We went in together. The two officers and me. I unlocked the front door very quietly with my key. We came in through the front hallway, past the recording device in the wall outlet, past the closet with their coats, and we stood for a second in the front hall and listened. The scraping was still going on. He was working on the cabinet. He'd given up on the door of the office, I figured out later, and gone for the cabinet in the front room, the one where he must have figured out I kept things, because he'd seen me take my mother's ring out of it on Christmas morning to show my daughter. I led them down the hall. The door of the front room was half open. He was on his knees, with his back to us. He had the silver letter opener in one hand, the one from my grandmother that came over from Galway in 1923, and a flathead screwdriver in the other, and he was working at the back of the cabinet where the false panel was. He didn't hear us until the female officer said, "Sir, put down the tools and turn around slowly." I have never seen a face change color the way his did. He was kneeling, and he turned his head, and he saw me, and then he saw the two uniformed officers behind me, and his face went the color of skim milk. He dropped the screwdriver. The letter opener stayed in his hand a second longer, and the male officer said, "Sir, drop it now." And he dropped it. He said, "Mom, what is this?" He said it like I was the one who'd done something wrong. He said, I was looking for the spare key to the storage locker. My fishing tackle is in there, I just needed two." The female officer said, "Sir, please stand up slowly and put your hands on top of your head." Stephen, the lawyer, pulled into my driveway about 20 minutes after that. He came in carrying his briefcase like he was making a house call, which I suppose he was. By that time, my son-in-law was in the back of the cruiser. Stephen sat with me at the kitchen table and we talked about what would happen next, the recordings, the notebook, the civil side, the criminal side, the protection order. I would file that afternoon, for myself and for my daughter. My daughter came home at 5:30. She was supposed to come home at 6. The cruiser was gone by then, but Stephen's Acura was still in the driveway. She came in through the front door and saw my face and Stephen's briefcase, and she said, "What happened?" I said, "Sweetheart, sit down. I have to tell you some things." I told her, "Sit down. I have to tell you some things." I told her, all of it. I played her one of the recordings. I picked the worst one, the one where he was on the phone with his brother talking about her like she was a project he was managing. I watched her face while she listened, and I watched my daughter come back into her own face for the first time in I don't know how many years. Not all at once. In pieces. Anger first, then disbelief, then a kind of clarity that frightened me a little because I saw in it how much she was going to have to grieve. She didn't cry. She looked at me and said, "How long have you known?" I said, 2 months. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, 2 months. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I love you and I needed you to be safe. And I needed proof that you'd believe." She nodded. She put her hands flat on the table. She said, "Where is he?" I said, "He's at Central Station on King William. He's being charged." What he was charged with was a list of things. Break and enter. Attempted theft over $5,000. Mischief. Stephen added a civil suit later for elder financial abuse, which is a thing in Ontario now, which I didn't know until Stephen told me. The criminal trial took most of the spring. He pled out in the end. He got 18 months with parole eligibility at 6. His brother, who I'd never liked even at the wedding, testified against him in exchange for not being charged himself for some of the phone conversations. My daughter filed for divorce in February. The Calgary debts turned out to be much worse than she'd thought, and most of them were in his name only, thank God. She kept the cats. She didn't keep anything else from that life. She moved back in with me, properly this time, into the upstairs bedroom that had been hers as a girl. She started seeing a counselor at St. Joseph's, a woman who specialized in coercive control, which was a phrase I learned that year. She started laughing again, slowly. She got a permanent job at a clinic in Westdale. By the next summer, she was sleeping through the night. I want to say something to anyone watching this who's wondering if they're imagining it. The thing they're noticing about the man their daughter is married to, or the woman their son is married to. The little tightening they feel when that person walks into a room. The way their adult child has gotten quieter over the years. You are not imagining it. You are not a snobbish mother. You are not making things up to feel important. The body knows. Mine knew for years before I let myself listen to it. I am 67 years old, and I lost 10 years of my daughter's life because I didn't want to be the kind of mother who interfered. I am telling you, please, interfere. Quietly, carefully. Document. Get a lawyer. Get a friend. But don't ignore what your gut is telling you. I sit in my kitchen now, my own kitchen, where Dawn built the cabinets in 1984, and my daughter is in the front room with her tea. And the cats are in the window, and the recording device is still in the outlet behind the kettle, because I keep meaning to take it out and somehow I never do. I think I'll leave it there, not because I expect to need it again. Just because it reminds me that I trusted myself, once, when it counted. And I think every woman my age should have something in her house that reminds her of that. The snow's coming off the lake again tonight. My girl is laughing at something on her phone. She has the big laugh back, the belly laugh, the one I hadn't heard since she was 12. I'm going to make butter tarts tomorrow. She's going to help me roll the pastry. Nobody is going to come up the stairs and stand in the doorway and watch. That's the whole story. That's how it ended. I'm grateful every single day. I've thought about this story 1,000 times since that February afternoon, and what I keep coming back to isn't the cabinet or the cruiser or the moment his face went the color of skim milk. It's the years before. The years I had a feeling and I swallowed it. The years I told myself I was being a difficult mother-in-law, a snobbish woman from a different generation, a widow with too much time on her hands and not enough trust in the man my girl had chosen. Every time my body tightened up when he walked into a room, I called myself silly. I called myself old-fashioned. I shushed the part of me that knew. That's the cause. The years of polite silence, of looking the other way at Christmas dinners, of letting him interrupt her and laughing along like it was charming. That's what gave him the runway. By the time he was kneeling in my front room with a screwdriver in his hand, he'd had a decade of being told, by all of us, that nobody was watching. The effect was inevitable. People become what we allow them to become. And silence is its own kind of permission. I think now about what nearly happened. If Marjorie hadn't needed to drive her grandkids to Oakville, if the snow hadn't started early, if I'd come home at 3:30 like I was supposed to, he'd have had my mother's ring, the cash, the bond certificates, and he'd have been at supper that night asking me how book club went, with my grandmother's letter opener back in the drawer where it belonged. And my girl would have stayed in that fog another year, another 5 years, however long it took for him to wear her down to nothing. What saved us wasn't luck, though. Not really. The snow was luck. The rest of it I built. The notebook in the Hilroy. The recording devices in the wall outlets. The phone call to Patricia. The lock on the office door. The $11,000 Don had called running away money, sitting in the safe for 30 years like he knew, somehow, that one day his girl would need a reason to believe her mother. Trust your gut, but then do the work. Feeling something isn't enough. You have to write it down. You have to call the lawyer. You have to be willing to look like a paranoid old woman to your friends until the day you're proven right. And the part I want my daughter to learn, the part I want every woman watching to learn, is that strength at 67 looks different than it did at 30. It's quieter. It's slower. It's a coffee tin in a closet full of labeled USB sticks. It's a friend who's known you since 1979. It's the patience to wait 2 months while a man digs his own hole. Because you understand that proof matters more than rage. I was afraid the whole time. I never stopped being afraid. But fear and courage aren't opposites, eh? They sit at the same kitchen table and you pour them both a cup of tea and you keep going.